The Cold School, Part 1, Episode 1. Arrival April 1st, April Fool's Day, the final years of the Soviet Union, and Ilyushin. 62 had already begun descending into Yakutsk airport. Outside, the sun was blindingly bright. Then the flight attendant made the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, the temperature at the airport is minus 30 degrees Celsius. Minus 30. And this was already considered spring. There were 3 of us on board, fresh out of flight school, flying in from Kiev to begin our aviation careers through the old Soviet assignment system. The previous summer, we had already completed our pre-graduation internship there. The Yakutsk Aviation Unit had recently received 3 brand-new Tupolev Tu-154Bs, and they needed crews badly. Still, nobody really believed we would actually come, but we did. The squadron building stood right beside the terminal. 5 minutes after landing, we were already there with our luggage. The expressions around us were a strange combination of joy and disbelief. Mostly disbelief. Nobody had expected us, which was slightly ironic considering this was still the rigid Soviet Union, and we carried official documents obligating them to hire us. The pilots, however, welcomed us warmly enough. Almost every face around us looked Slavic, pilots chasing northern salaries. Back then, the Soviet ruble was still considered serious money. Well, the squadron commander said, "Go get yourselves processed." So we headed toward the aviation headquarters nearby, another miserable wooden building. And then, about 150 meters from the squadron office, we suddenly noticed something completely out of place. 2 beautiful log buildings, not just wooden buildings, expertly crafted from massive timber, like something from an old postcard. The only problem was, the windows were empty, no glass, completely abandoned. Naturally, we went inside. What we saw was astonishing. The interiors were still beautifully preserved. Even the wooden walls looked almost perfect. We stood there staring in disbelief. What a waste of perfectly good building material, I thought. Eventually, we learned the truth. The buildings had been left behind by the Americans after the Second World War, during the Lend-Lease operations, when Bell P-39 era Cobra fighters were ferried through Alaska and Siberia. This had once been a transit base. And just to be clear, this was 1987. The war had ended a very long time ago. Yet somehow the abandoned American buildings looked far better than the active Soviet administrative offices surrounding them. That was probably the first moment when the feeling of surrealism began creeping in. But we had no time to think about philosophy. At that point, we didn't even have a place to sleep. And then the head of the aviation unit, a short Yakut man named Shamayev, greeted us with the following words. "You are not needed here. I have nowhere to house you. Go back where you came from." Even if we had desperately wanted to leave, we couldn't have. Our pockets were empty. And for hundreds of kilometers around, there was neither railway nor even a proper road. Just like in the old Soviet song, you can only reach this distant land by airplane. Episode 2. The Dormitory. Well, Shamayev's shouting did not impress us very much. We had seen him for the first time in our lives, and he himself had never even flown on the Tu-154. Besides, there was very little he could actually do. Soviet law still existed, at least on paper, and according to that law, he was required to hire us. Where exactly we were supposed to live, however, remained a complete mystery. Formally, everything looked perfectly respectable. We had official employment, legal entitlement to housing, and absolutely nowhere to stay. That was the late Soviet Union in a nutshell. Paperwork and reality had already begun drifting into separate dimensions. Still, we had not arrived from the moon. We suspected something like this might happen. All 3 of us were married, but fortunately, we had left our families back home for the time being. We had only brought a few cans of food for the first days. Carrying anything more across half the Soviet Union would have been unrealistic. The food situation itself was also slightly more complicated than it might sound today. The stores around the airport were almost empty, yes, but airport cafeterias and crew dining rooms still functioned reasonably well. Nobody lived luxuriously there, but pilots could eat normally enough. The real problems began outside that small, protected aviation world. The legendary Communist Party was still firmly in control of the country, so our first destination became the office of the local party organizer, attached to the flight unit. He welcomed us almost like family and devoted 2 full hours to us. More precisely, we spent 2 hours trying to escape politely. After about 5 minutes, it became obvious that no actual help was coming, but for the next couple of hours, we listened to long philosophical explanations about how difficult life in the North had once been. When we first arrived here, he said at one point with great significance, things were much harder. This was entirely believable. He spoke warmly, sympathetically, and absolutely uselessly. Our final hope was the bachelor dormitory, the only 2-story stone building anywhere nearby. Surrounded by endless wooden barracks, it looked almost luxurious. Naturally, the dormitory supervisor immediately informed us that there were no vacancies, but Ukrainian chocolates still possessed considerable diplomatic power in those days. After a brief negotiation, she lowered her voice and shared some insider information. Well, technically there are 2 free beds in a 3-man room, but there's a Yakut guy living there with papers from a psychiatric hospital. Nobody wants to stay with him. If you want, I can arrange it. By then, we had already been awake for nearly 24 hours. At that point, sharing a room with a mentally unstable Yakut no longer sounded like a major problem. Fine, we answered. Put us there. The dormitory housed people from virtually every enterprise connected with the airport district, including pilots. A 3rd bed for our little group was eventually found elsewhere in the building, temporarily abandoned by a pilot away on vacation. At last, we dropped our luggage in the room and, for the first time that day, had the strange feeling that we might actually be staying there for quite a while. Our new home turned out to be the only 2-story stone building anywhere near the airport. Against the endless rows of crooked wooden barracks slowly sinking into the permafrost, the dormitory looked almost luxurious, at least from the outside. Inside, however, luxury quickly became a relative concept. The room assigned to us contained 3 iron beds, a crooked wardrobe, a small table, and a radiator capable of producing either unbearable heat or complete despair. There seemed to be no middle setting. And the 3rd occupant of the room was our mysterious Yakut neighbor with documents from a psychiatric clinic. His name was Spiridon. Episode 3, Spiridon. At first glance, Spiridon looked entirely normal, quiet, calm, never aggressive. Perhaps the only unusual thing about him was the name itself. But in Yakutia, old Russian names had somehow survived long after disappearing from the rest of the Soviet Union. Spiridon worked in a carpentry shop near the airport and spoke very little. The first thing that truly surprised us was his morning ritual. On our very first day, we had nowhere to rush. Ground training had not started yet, so we were still half asleep when Spiridon woke up before dawn. More precisely, he woke all of us up. Sitting upright on his bed, he lifted his heavy work boots and slammed them violently against the floor. Why this was necessary remained unclear. Then came the second stage of the ceremony. Spiridon produced a pair of ancient socks full of holes and began striking them against the corner of the wardrobe with considerable force. Oddly enough, this part seemed to contain some primitive logic. Apparently, the procedure softened them into wearable condition. After that, he dressed with astonishing speed, drank water directly from the kettle spout, and disappeared to work. The entire operation lasted less than 2 minutes. For several seconds after the door closed, nobody spoke. Then Volodya slowly sat up on his bed and looked at us with deep concern. Volodya had arrived in Yakutsk together with us and, back in flight school, had been the leader of our training group. He was 3 years older than the rest of us, which at that age already made him seem almost like a veteran. Before entering civilian aviation, he had completed military service flying obsolete MiG-17 fighters somewhere near Voroshilovgrad, the city now called Luhansk. Officially, the Soviet system insisted that fighter pilots could only be trained through higher military academies and serve as commissioned officers. Officially. In reality, the country was full of strange loopholes. Old aircraft still existed, and apparently someone had decided it was cheaper to teach conscripts to fly them. As Volodya himself liked to explain, they were preparing kamikazes in case of war. Unlike the rest of us, Volodya possessed almost military levels of cleanliness. Every item near his bed was arranged with geometric precision. That evening, he carefully placed a pair of thick wool socks, knitted by his wife, on the radiator beside his bed. In that miserable little room, the socks looked almost elegant. Spiridon noticed them immediately. He said nothing, which, as we would soon discover, meant absolutely nothing. The next day passed in routine ground training, paperwork, briefings, and endless wandering between various wooden administrative buildings. All of them looked equally temporary, despite apparently standing there for decades. Toward evening, we finally returned to the dormitory and decided to have dinner. Knowing perfectly well where we were going, we had brought several cans of meat stew from home. Food in airport cafeterias was perfectly adequate, but ordinary stores in Yakutsk were another matter entirely. Meat there existed mostly in theoretical form, usually frozen solid, sold raw, and strictly rationed. Volodya opened one of the cans and began eating. At that exact moment, Spiridon entered the room. Volodya, unable to overcome his civilized upbringing, politely gestured toward the food. "Join us if you want." "I won't refuse," Spiridon answered instantly. Without hesitation, he sat down and plunged his spoon directly into Volodya's can. Volodya froze for a second, but said nothing. Instead, he calmly turned toward his bed. Then he began searching for the wool socks his wife had knitted for him. They were gone. At first, he searched quietly, then more carefully. Then he even asked me whether I had accidentally moved them somewhere. And that was when his eyes slowly dropped toward Spiridon's feet. To this day, I still remember the expression on Volodya's face. Explaining the problem to Spiridon turned out to be impossible. From his point of view, nothing unusual had happened. Warm socks left beside a radiator were obviously communal property, abandoned by irresponsible owners. Volodya spent nearly 3 hours boiling them in a saucepan. Even afterward, he still could not force himself to wear them. Meanwhile, Spiridon wandered around the room, delivering fragmented philosophical observations about strange city people who, according to him, voluntarily brushed their teeth. Then, quite unexpectedly, he started running around the room shouting, "I'm not afraid of you! I'm not afraid of you!" Nobody had attempted to frighten him in the slightest. That evening, we finally concluded that the medical certificate had probably not been issued without reason. We needed to find another room. Episode 4. Northern Reality. Yakutsk itself looked divided into two completely different realities. Around the airport stood endless rows of old wooden houses, crooked, sagging into the permafrost, as if slowly melting into the ground. A little farther away began the modern city. Gray stone apartment blocks, usually no taller than 5 stories. Nothing there could be buried underground. Heating pipes, water lines, sewage. Everything ran above the surface inside thick, insulated tubes stretching across the streets like industrial vines. The permanently frozen earth underneath allowed no other solution. Oddly enough, the system also helped stray cats survive the winter. During the worst frosts, they hid between the heating and sewage pipes, where at least some warmth remained. I noticed those cats almost immediately. Most of them were missing the tips of their ears. At first, I assumed they fought constantly. The locals explained otherwise. They had simply frozen them off. Even the trees seemed damaged by the climate, thin, stunted things barely resembling proper forests. The shops looked depressing. Bread, 3-liter jars of canned juice, a few sacks of grain. Butter was rationed, 400 grams per person each month. But for Soviet people, the real disaster was alcohol. Half a liter of vodka per person per month. That was the official limit, and nothing else. We had not even started flying yet when we began producing homemade wine in the dormitory. Surprisingly, the local juices were actually quite decent. Natural, sweet enough already. We bought a 3-liter jar of grape juice, threw in a handful of rice, sealed the lid, ran a small tube into another jar filled with water, sealed everything as best we could, and then monitored the bubbles like laboratory technicians. When the bubbling stopped, the product was considered ready. At this point, I realized the story is beginning to sound less like aviation literature and more like an illegal Soviet cookbook. The Yakutsk Aviation Unit operated large numbers of Antonov and 24 aircraft serving remote local routes. Most of the airfields were unpaved. In spring, they turned into oceans of mud. Even today, videos still circulate online showing An-24s taking off inside enormous clouds of dirt. That was not an exaggeration. The aircraft often returned completely covered in mud, especially the tail. The crews were unbelievably young, a perfectly normal situation. The captain was 21 years old, the co-pilot 20. We lived together in the same dormitory, and sometimes they even took us along on flights while we were still stuck in ground training. Honestly, it felt more like extreme sports disguised as routine Soviet aviation. One flight was enough for me. Oddly enough, serious accidents were rare. The incidents were usually absurd rather than catastrophic. One crew forgot to synchronize the compass system before departure and calmly flew in the exact opposite direction until the dispatcher called them back. Another time, during takeoff roll, the captain scratched his head, and the flight engineer somehow interpreted the gesture as a command to retract the landing gear. The aircraft struck the runway with its tail and triggered the fire protection system, and yet, somehow, the whole system continued functioning. Before long, however, we ourselves became something like kings. The Tu-154 had only recently appeared there. There were very few of them, but the routes were prestigious: Moscow, Leningrad, Mineral Vody, usually with 2 stops along the way, but to us it still felt like flying to another planet. Officially, it was the same Soviet Union, same slogans, same portraits on the walls, but suddenly there were stores full of food, no ration coupons, alcohol everywhere, real life. People in Yakutsk had money, good northern salaries. Whenever someone asked us to bring something back from Moscow or Leningrad, they always gave us extra money for taxis. Carrying that amount of cargo by hand across Moscow was simply impossible. The only real limitation became our personal carrying capacity. As a result, we moved around Moscow mostly by taxi like wealthy foreign businessmen, and when we returned to Yakutsk, trucks would sometimes drive directly to the aircraft galley door to collect everybody's orders. Episode 5. The Lenin Room. Time passed, and then summer arrived almost overnight. There was no spring to speak of. After months of brutal cold, the temperature suddenly began rising several degrees every day until, by June, Yakutsk somehow reached plus 30 Celsius. We had already started adapting to northern life. The aviation unit even had its own yacht club on the Lena River. Strangely enough, in the middle of that frozen northern world, I learned to sail there. First on a tiny, unstable dinghy called a luch, which seemed personally determined to throw me into the water at every opportunity, and later on a fast, surprisingly stable trimaran. Little by little, life was beginning to feel almost normal, but reality was approaching fast. My wife was graduating from university in Kiev within a month with a degree in computer programming, and soon she and our daughter, not yet 2 years old, would be arriving in Yakutsk, which meant I now had to solve a very Soviet problem: where exactly they were supposed to live. Officially, renting apartments privately in the Soviet Union was not allowed. Unofficially, it existed everywhere. But finding anything in Yakutsk without mobile phones, internet, or proper contacts was almost impossible. Even speaking with home was difficult. Long-distance calls to Kiev had to be booked through a special telephone exchange office. After waiting several hours, you would eventually be invited into a tiny booth where, for a few precious minutes, distorted voices from the other side of the country emerged through crackling static. Everything became even more complicated because of the 7-hour time difference, essentially the same as between Kiev and New York, only in the opposite direction. Still, something had to be done. The first problem I solved was employment for my wife. Even now it sounds absurd. I'd always been a fairly shy person, but extreme situations sometimes produce unexpected talents. Right in the center of Yakutsk stood the most beautiful building in the city, the Yakutsk Institute. Compared to everything around it, the place looked almost luxurious. After several hours wandering through endless corridors and offices, somehow talking my way past secretaries and administrators, I managed to arrange a programming job for my wife, starting literally on the day of her arrival. Housing, however, proved far more difficult. One group of people kept promising me a room while quietly wasting my time, until suddenly only 2 days remained before my family's arrival. At that point, the situation became catastrophic. Still, while wandering around the airport district, I had developed a habit of studying the windows of the family dormitories, noticing which rooms remained permanently dark at night. One building especially caught my attention. Its official name was ITR-7. To this day, I have no idea what ITR actually stood for. Probably something related to engineering and technical workers, as Soviet abbreviations usually did. By then, however, the residents represented a far more chaotic mixture of humanity. The building itself was wooden, crooked, and visibly exhausted by northern life. At the end of the corridor stood a terrifying communal bathroom that functioned only during summer. In winter, it simply froze solid, but one corner room always remained dark. "Who lives there?" I asked some local residents. Nobody. It turned out the owners had already received an apartment in the stones, as people called the concrete apartment blocks in Yakutsk, but all their belongings still remained inside. And anyway, someone added, it used to be the Lenin room, the place where political lectures about the greatness of the Soviet system had once been held. It's twice as big as the others. The decision formed almost instantly. I found an axe and broke open the flimsy door. The room really was enormous by local standards. Along one wall stood piles of furniture covered with blankets, chairs, a table, an old sofa. There was even a refrigerator. Looking around the place, I suddenly remembered the abandoned American buildings we had discovered when first arriving in Yakutsk, and I thought, what a waste of perfectly good building material. So, naturally, I decided to build a second room. For half a day, I ripped wooden panels from the walls and carried boards back and forth through the corridor. Then I built a partition across part of the room. Suddenly, we had two rooms. The smaller one became a kitchen. I bought a hand-operated wash basin, a sink, and a bucket for drainage. Somehow, everything started looking unexpectedly cozy. I even managed to buy a small Soviet television set. Only one final detail remained. After considerable effort, I eventually tracked down the actual owners of the room. I explained the situation and offered to pay rent. They refused the money. "Use it," they told me. "At least now we know our things are safe." Technically, the room no longer belonged to them anyway. In the Soviet Union, there was no true private ownership of housing. Everything belonged to the state, which merely granted permission to live somewhere. By then, however, the entire system already carried the faint smell of collapse. Order was disappearing everywhere. The end of the country was approaching, even if few people fully understood it yet. But at least in practical terms, I was finally ready to meet my family. At the time, this felt like a major victory. In reality, the truly absurd part of the story had not even started yet.